As we gather, they're selecting a jury in the George Floyd trial. We are witnessing the largest stimulus package in US history, moving rockily through. Uh, there is labor legislation we haven't seen in decades, probably locked down in the House because the Senate needs 60. There's talk about soft abolition of the filibuster. There's a talk about a lot that this country has not talked about in a long time, though we've been talking about it at the Nation. And Ben Jealous has been talking about all of these issues for many, many years. Ben has led many lives. I would be remiss if I simply identified him as what he is today, which is head of a great organization many of you are involved with or know, People for the American Way and its fund, a group founded, I believe, 40 years ago by Norman Lear, who's been a great supporter of the Nation, who some of you may have seen in fine form on the Golden Globes a week or so ago, I think at 98, 99, extraordinary. Ben has been an activist, a journalist, head of a human rights organization, the youngest head of the NAACP, a mighty coalition builder, a fierce campaigner for social justice, and as also venture capitalist and nonprofit executive. And by no means least, a powerful candidate for governor of Maryland. And I firmly believe winning is a lot, but Ben will be back in some form running again, I am sure. Not many have been thrown out of Columbia University for protesting, which he did. Not in '68, but he was protesting the university's attempt to, quote, occupy space where Malcolm X had been assassinated. Ben left, went to work for the Newspaper Publishers Association. He worked for the Jackson Advocate as a reporter. He returned to Columbia and proceeded to win a Rhodes. And a few years later, I did try to bring him to the Nation, but he probably wisely went to head Amnesty USA. He's also been very involved over the years, just growing up with Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum. Stacey remains a close ally of his. And then in 2008, he was chosen in a very tough race as the youngest ever president, I believe youngest ever, right, Ben, of the president and CEO of the NAACP. And during his tenure, he made important strides in doubling the organization's budget and growing its online activist base. But probably more important, he positioned the organization at the forefront of critical social justice issues such as the Trayvon Martin case, the fight against voter ID laws, and major protests over the New York police and other police department stop and frisk policies. I was proud to march with Ben, and he had his 6-year-old daughter on his shoulders in 2012 in a silent march, harking back to the NAACP's 1917 silent march down Fifth Avenue to protest Bloomberg's stop and frisk policies. Ben pushed for marriage equality, rights for undocumented workers and undocumented people. And he likes to say, and abolishing the death penalty. As I said, he was the 2018 Democratic nominee for governor of Maryland. He ran a race. He worked with Bernie Sanders and George Sanders. He ran a race committed to economic justice fused with racial equity. Medicare for all was a big issue. It was a really smart and spirited race. He's interesting in terms of his relationship to Bernie and a lot of Bernie folks, because he was asked once, are you a socialist? And he said, no, I'm a social venture person. And I think that's an interesting, area to explore. But we are happy to call Ben a longtime friend of the Nation. He's been on the cruise. He was a great speaker, great participant. And it's great to have you here today, Ben, to talk to us. He's written a piece, which Gia has put in the chat, about, I don't know if he agrees, but it's probably as important as the Civil Rights Act in its own time in terms of what it is offering to advance a democracy that has not been very strong, that needs that more perfect union jolt. Anyway, Ben, finally, he's working on a memoir/history of the Black justice struggle, which all of us have to acquire next year.
Well, thank you. It's so good to be here. And, I really do consider myself to be part of the Nation family. Look forward to the Nation cruise coming back. Happy to be here on the land cruise with you.
Yeah.
You know, I've been reading The Nation magazine since I was 10 years old. Somewhere I still have the old Ronald Reagan doormat that came with the subscription that year. You know, S1 as it is now, because it was HR1, but it passed in the House, the For the People Act, really is this generation's big addition to that arc of legislation that starts with the 15th Amendment, or even really, quite frankly, states overturning the property provision on voting, even before that, all the way through the work of the suffragettes and the 19th Amendment, all the way through the Voting Rights Act. And now the For the People Act would really require big money contributors to disclose. 400 billionaires invested $1.6 billion in our election the last time around, and most of that dark money. It would end racist gerrymandering. It would provide for voter registration to be automatic, finally. Same day voter registration, online voter registration, ending voter roll purges and discriminatory voter ID laws. It's what John Lewis was fighting for at the end of his life. And you know, later this afternoon, I'm going to be testifying in Senator Whitehouse's committee about the corporate capture of our courts, the way in which John Roberts, you know, can be maybe unpredictable on some issues, but if it's in a corporation's best interest, he's always right in line. And the Supreme Court, we talked about as sort of conservative or liberal, we often miss that it's corporate dominated. And what John Lewis understood was that racist attempts to suppress our vote and corporations changing the rules to allow for dark money to overtake our voting process are deeply connected. I remember sitting down with Mike Brune, the president of the Sierra Club, years ago when I was running the NAACP, and the Sierra Club had not weighed in on voting rights issues ever. I mean, they're older than the NAACP. They didn't weigh in for women's suffrage. They didn't weigh in for the 15th Amendment. They didn't weigh in for the Voting Rights Act. But starting 10 years ago, they began working very assiduously on fighting voter ID and fighting voter suppression. And why? Because when we sat down and we discussed it, it was very clear why the Koch brothers were attacking voting rights. As Van Jones would say, there is no green vote without the black and brown vote. Latinos are the most likely to support environmental regulation. Blacks are the second most likely. And it's the same when you look at consumer protections. It's the same when you look at support for trade unions. When you attack the black and brown vote, when you attack working women, and those tend to be the three groups that are most impacted by laws like voter ID, you enhance corporate power by attacking the voting power of the very demographics that are most likely to push back on corporate power. Mm-hmm. And so we as activists do ourselves a disservice if we simply call out voter suppression as racist and we don't actually follow the money and point out that it's also enhancing corporate power. There is a place where liberals and libertarians meet. And quite frankly, we have worked relationships there to begin to downsize prison systems across the country. And I think that we would benefit from a more vibrant conversation about the conservative principles that used to push back against voter ID, the conservative principles that used to empower pushback from the right around corporate dark money. And now we have this kind of Koch brother conservative that is first and foremost a financial opportunist, and secondarily racist, and yet has the same impact at the end of the day. And so that's what we're focused on at People For right now. It's what the movement's focused on. It's why John Lewis at the end of his life was so crystal clear on the need to get money out of politics. that you can't just deal with voter suppression simply as it's experienced by folks in my community, for instance, as a racist attack on our right to vote. You also have to deal with the reality that there's a lot of money behind it that may or may not be racist money. It may just simply be interested in attacking the voting demographics who are the most likely to support environmental regulation, which is counter to the interests of those business people. And you mentioned my involvement in business. My mentor is a guy named Mitch Kapor. He invented Lotus back in the day. And like my mom, he has been a Buddhist for most of his adult life. And we both firmly believe that the only way that we save this planet, the only way that we rebuild our country is we ultimately show the world that you don't have to sacrifice your values to build companies. That in fact, companies are the building block of our economy. And if we want an economy that's just, then we've got to build companies that are just. If we want an economy that's sustainable, then we have to build companies that operate in a way that's sustainable. And so that's been my involvement. For me, it's a direct extension of what Frederick Douglass was doing when he built the Freedmen's Bank. You know, it's we used to build banks. My grandmother's great grandfather was a legislator in Virginia right after the Civil War. He was one of the few Black delegates to the Virginia Constitutional Convention of 1867 and the first class of Blacks in the Virginia House of Delegates. And he built a bank at the time to help build our community, after slavery had ended. More recently, I went on the bank of more recently, I went on the board of Aspiration.com, which is a bank that requires any of the community banks. It's a neobank, an online bank, and the accounts actually are resident in community banks across the country. And all those community banks have agreed to not lend $1 to the oil and gas industry. And so I think that we as progressives have to be involved in the economy in a visionary way. And what we know at Aspiration is that we have literally taken billions of dollars out of circulation for the oil and gas industry. And that's critical when you see that big banks are financing things like Line 3 coming across the border from Canada, the sort of next attempt at Keystone, if you will. It's the most short-sighted thing in the world for a banker to invest in the destruction of the very planet that sustains their family, let alone their bank. And so, that's, again, I absolutely believe that as progressives, we got to use every means at our disposal. I remember the day that that your predecessor was excited that the nation finally broke a profit, because then it would be more sustainable. Victor was excited, and it was a reminder, that this idea, if you will, of values-aligned capitalism isn't a new one. It's as old as the nation itself.
I'm interested in the Aspiration, I believe, is Joe Sandberg, someone who's supported the nation, lives in California, and believes strongly in the earned income tax credit. That's been a big. And Keith Mestridge, who is head of Amalgamated Bank, is involved with our work. And he's now involved with a project on underbanked and unbanked people. But let me ask you, if I could, the generational divisions. You have a Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen the protests, the demonstrations, the very powerful ones in the street. And then you have, it's too crude, but the NAACP, let's say, an older generation, more based in the churches. How do you see that playing out? There have been some key issues, I don't need to name them for you, but like defund the police, I don't think went down as well with an older generation. The socialism issue again. So how do you see this multi-generational movement moving forward? And because you were part of the NAACP, particularly focus on where it goes as a major institution in our country.
The metaphors that work for me are historical and drawn from ecology. Yeah. If you look at the Black freedom struggle, if you look at the progressive movement in our country as a forest, the NAACP would be the 1,000-foot tall old knotty redwood that's so wide at its base that it's literally invisible to the casual observer. And then you stand up next to it and you're just blown away.
Mm.
It's that big tree that provides shelter for everything else to grow. It was a saying in the NAACP, what do you call an old Black Panther? Your local NAACP president. And the truth in that is that a lot of the young people in SNCC came out of the NAACP. A lot of the young people in the Black Panther Party, including Fred Hampton himself, came out of the NAACP. And when I turned on the protests outside of St. Louis, Ferguson, in 2013, who did I see but a whole bunch of the NAACP kids we'd spent the last 5 years training. And in my tenure at the NAACP, we spent a lot of energy getting folks back into the fight on individual cases. The Scott sisters, John McNeil in Georgia, Troy Davis, and a whole list of others, including like a half dozen out of New York, many of whom's photos, when we were in that march, we were carrying in that march. And that march, that silent march, was like 6 months before the launch of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
And so the NAACP is a part of this virtuous cycle of activism where we trained the very young and we organized, folks who are sort of around and above retirement age. And in between, people live their lives as activists, from their late teens kind of through middle age. They usually fade out when they get a mortgage and a couple of kids in a car. And then they pop back up again, right? In the NAACP. So my prediction today is that 30 years from now, there will be a whole bunch of people who are currently Black Lives Matter activists who are, rejoining the NAACP or joining it for the first time. That's the way that it works. We're like the NPR of Black activists.
One final question, really.
Well, actually, probably more like PBS, right? Because PBS is like there when you're young, you're like watching Sesame Street, and then you don't watch it again until you decide that you really like British mysteries.
Right.
And invariably, you have at least a few gray hairs when that happens.
Yeah. No, that wanted you partly because cannabis legalization was a big issue in your governor's race, Medicare for all, and economic justice as well. But if you could just tell those on the webinar briefly why your godbrother is Dave Chappelle and the story of how he saved your life, just because it does relate to the issue you then lifted up.
Well, Dave Chappelle's dad was my dad's best friend. They met playing poker and drinking late in Washington, D.C. when they were in their early 20s and became best friends. Dave's dad was an impressive man. He went to Brown at 15. And dropped out of Brown his senior year because, as he put it, there were 3 Black men in my class. One went crazy. One was accused of rape junior year, and I wasn't going to wait to see what happened to me. And Dave's dad would go on to be a professor for decades at Antioch University. My parents recruited his parents there. And then his father would get his BA as a professor. I mean, if you want to understand why Dave Chappelle is so brilliant, you just got to know his parents. And his mom was a fearless activist. She was the translator for Patrice Lumumba. Yeah. And she was the first Black woman ordained in the Unitarian Church. So that's Dave. And so I call my godbrother. We had come up together in New York as young men, in our late teens, 17, 18 years old. We moved to the city. And I got kicked out for protests and found myself in Mississippi. Me, Stacey Abrams, and Derek Johnson, who now runs the NAACP, Stacey and I were 20, Derek was 22, and we were trying to stop a governor from turning Mississippi Valley State University into a prison. The state had 3 public historically Black universities. The Supreme Court had ordered the state to eradicate its dual system of higher education. And the governor, who was a prototype for Trump, a businessman who had made his name suing Mississippi's policy of 10% minority set-asides in a state that's 35% Black, and was a proud member of the White Citizens Council, which had been renamed the Conservative Citizens Council. That guy had said that he was going to shut down Valley State, shut down Alcorn State. These are two of the three public historically Black colleges, make Valley State a prison, and make the third, Jackson State, majority white within 2 years. And Stacy and I and Derek organized a movement to stop it, and we would be successful. In the meantime, we got to earn money. So I like raised money for the, for the buses and everything. So I called Dave, and Dave comes down. Now at the time, Dave Chappelle was so famous that we could sell some tickets for $5, but most of them were $3. And what it said on the poster was a very funny guy, YSB magazine. YSB was like Essence for Black teens. It was Young Sisters and Brothers magazine. And then it also mentioned he had been on Def Comedy Jam. That's how early this was. But it was also a different time because, it was pre 9/11. It was, like 93, 94. And, planes were like Greyhound in the sky. There was like very little sort of security, if you will. So Dave lands in Jackson and he hops in my Jeep. Now, I had just gotten out of jail for protests like that morning. And we had been getting death threats for a week. And I kind of had, it was a little bit jittery. And Dave hops in my Jeep and he says, "Hey, man, what are the cops like down here?" And I'm like, "Dave, hello, good morning, nice to see you, been a while. Why is that," I cussed, "why is that your first question?" And he said, "Because I got a dime bag of pot in my duffel." And I said, "Well, welcome to Jackson, Mississippi. I just got out of jail this morning. I can assure you that the cops are everything you would expect in Mississippi. And let's get back to campus. I'm sure somebody will take that dime bag off your hands, but I would appreciate if you don't smoke it while you're here. I don't want to have to organize your defense. Mine's enough to worry about." And so we turn around, we leave Jackson, Mississippi's International Airport, and we're headed to Jackson State University. And I make a wrong turn. I pull a U-turn. And Dave starts yelling, 50, 50, pull over. And I'm like, I don't see a siren. He's like, "Ben, look closer. It's a Crown Vic. There's a Black guy and a white guy. The white guy's driving, the Black guy's in the front seat. They're both wearing suits. They got to be cops. It's a Crown Vic. Pull over." So I'm like, well, I've been getting death threats at that point for weeks. And so I said, "Well, there's a Taco Bell up there. I'll pull over to Taco Bell." So we put on our blinkers, so they know we tend to turn over. We slow down and we kind of ease our way into the Taco Bell. This Crown Vic pulls up beside us, and a white guy jumps out and pulls a nickel-plated pearl-handled 45, a nickel-plated pearl-handled 45 out of a shoulder holster, and eases off the safety. And I grew up shooting guns, so I understood what he was doing. And I look at Dave and I'm like, "That's not police issue. I'm getting the hell out of here." And I slam the car into reverse and I start to back up. And the guy points his 45 at us. And just then the Black guy jumps out and throws up a badge and says, "Stop, police." Well, we stop. He identifies himself. We put our hands up. And the white guy, orders me exactly how to turn off the car and get out of the vehicle. And we do all of that very, very slowly. And he walks up to me with his finger still on the trigger of his gun. And he pulls down his glasses and he looks at me and he says, "Aren't you the boy I've been seeing on television?" And just then the Black cop looks at Dave and says, "Aren't you the fella I saw on Def Jam last night?" And Dave's like, and the Black cop's like, "This boy's famous. He's famous. Bobby, this boy's famous." All of a sudden, the white officer just like relaxes, takes a deep breath, puts his gun away. And he said, "Okay, who are you?" What? I said, "Oh, he's from New York. We have a comedy show tonight. I'm just trying to get him there. It's at Jackson State." He's like, "Would you like a police escort?" We're like, "No, that's okay, officer. We just want to get back." I'm like, "Would you like 2 tickets tonight?" And he was like, "Yeah, it's like my buddy would like him too." So we gave him, I don't know, like 4 or 8 tickets or something. And we're on our way. And they came that night. And And, I tell you, that's how Dave saved my life. It's also how he endangered my life, but it's also how he saved my life, because I don't think that would have gone down the same way that day if it was somebody else. But the end of it is this: Dave has a joke about how white Southerners came up with the word, which he tells that night on stage. And in mixed audience in 1994, Mississippi, it was kind of a tense joke to tell. And an old Black woman walked up to me and she said, your friend's very funny. If they don't run him out of town tonight, we're going to run him out of town in the morning, because it ain't safe down here with Dave Chappelle. But that was it.
Thank you for sharing that
Yeah.
that story. And I know you
Well,
remain great friends.
Yeah, no, I mean, our fathers are best friends. We've been best friends since we were 18. Our daughters are now very close. It's
Great.
blessed to inherit a friendship. It's also a blessing to have a friend who speaks the truth to you, even when it's untimely. And he was talking then about how, how essentially white people never get busted, very, very rarely for pot
Yeah.
possession. It's not never, but it's very, very low percentage. And with Black folks, it had become a sport with the cops in places like New York.
Yep.
And that we needed to legalize it, that it was certainly no more harmful than alcohol, and
Cannabis,
possibly
yeah.
less, less.
Look how that issue has moved.
Yeah.
Erin, I see we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes, we do. Thank you for being here and for taking these questions.
Thank you, Erin.
When people first came on, they started telling us where they're here from, and I want to let you know that you have an audience from all around the nation: Alaska, North Carolina, California, Kentucky, Texas, New York, New Hampshire. So that, I guess, is one of the silver linings of this moment and switching to Zoom. And thank you for being here for all of them.
Absolutely.
To get right to it, Simon Threlkeld has a very specific question about this legislation. He wants to know, he said that some argue that the campaign and party funding parts of HR 1 are stacked against third parties, independent candidates, and insurgent candidates in the major parties, and that they fail to do near enough to end dark money via 501c front groups. What do you think of this critique of the funding parts of HR 1?
I think the funding parts of HR 1 are primarily about disclosure, and they're a big step in the right direction. What we really need to do is end Citizens United, and that's going to require a constitutional amendment. We at People For are very much focused on that. But it says a lot, quite frankly, that the right wing is pushing back so hard on this disclosure, because what you would find is that a lot of the politicians are wholly owned subsidiaries of the corporations that are also running the campaigns to put right-wing justices on the Supreme Court. They can spend $18 million on a single campaign, for instance, and that the very advocacy groups that are supporting all of that are also, and then it all goes back to a handful of billionaires. And that's, we believe that's the first step in really just helping the people of the country understand what we're up against. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of groups on the left take advantage of the same rules. The difference is that groups like ours are very clear that we support these disclosures and we would follow them happily as soon as the other side is required to do so too. They, on the other hand, are fighting the disclosures because they have something to hide.
Thank you. Continuing on how we get some things done, Virginia Johnson wonders if you think there's any possibility of getting rid of the filibuster.
We have to. There's really, none of this gets done unless we get rid of the filibuster. There's a lot of pressure needs to be put on Manchin. There's a lot of pressure needs to be put on Collins and Murkowski and Kyrsten Sinema. We got kind of these sort of four moderates, if you will, extreme moderates in the middle, and we've got to move them. Everybody's focused right now on building those movements. It's frankly, if looking at the midterms, the next couple of cycles, these senators have to be able to go back to their voters and show that they delivered. We can't go through what we went through in the early years of the Obama administration, where the Senate just became the place where all good legislation dies. And so whether it's the $15 minimum wage, whether it's public safety reforms, or whether it's all these democracy reforms, HR 1, which we've been talking about, HR 4, the Voting Rights Restoration Act, HR 51, statehood for Washington, D.C. The only way that they get through is we get rid of the filibuster.
Can you let us know who in the House and Senate are the most reliable allies for these issues you just mentioned, and for people for the American way?
Yeah, it's there's a lot. I mean, it's probably 40 senators that we can always that we can always count on, and it's a wide range on these democracy issues. It ranges from Bernie Sanders and Liz Warren on one side to Chuck Schumer on the other. I mean, folks have really coalesced. I think John Lewis's leadership, not just in the House, but across the Congress, all the years of bringing folks down to Selma have really helped build a broad consensus. Folks like John Sarbanes and Jamie Raskin have been incredibly outspoken, but so has Cori Bush and kind of a range of folks, and that's the beauty of it. Is that whether it's folks kind of more in the center or folks on the left, when it comes to HR 1, when it comes to HR 4, when it comes to HR 51, the bulk of them are supportive.
Thank you. Pedro Baez asks, being president for People for the American Way gives you a greater platform to advocate a very progressive platform. What do you see as a very pressing issue at this moment?
Well, we have no bigger priority than reforming our democracy. It's fundamental to everything else that we want to get through. At the same time, we at People For have organized more than 1,500 young elected officials across the country, 350 school board members, 100 mayors. So all folks who took office before the age of 35, some of them took office at age 19. And we support them because, quite frankly, they're the link to the social movements like ours across this country. The youngest elected officials tend to have the most courage. Right now, we are very proud of Mayor Savante Myrick in Ithaca, New York, who appears to be pushing through the most progressive public safety reforms since George Floyd that we've seen. And we're hoping that there'll be able to be a movement built off of that across the country. We've been working with mayors, young mayors across the country for 6-7 months on a whole set of reforms. And right now, all eyes are on Ithaca. In a couple of weeks, there's going to be a vote there, and we're very, very hopeful that it'll mark the beginning of what needs to happen across the country. Great.
In your opening remarks, you mentioned that there's a place where liberals and libertarians cross, and mentioned specifically for-profit prisons. And I wonder, are there conversations going around in those areas where there's that intersection, and what are the issues?
Yeah, the point of disagreement for liberals and libertarians would be for-profit prisons, and usually the death penalty. The rest of criminal justice reform, there's been broad agreement on for some time. And that's how Stacey Abrams and I were able to work together with Governor Deal in Georgia to downsize their prison system. It's how the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition was able to pull together the NAACP wing of the Democratic Party and the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party to create a majority in the Texas legislature to pass through 52 progressive criminal justice reforms, only 2 of which Rick Perry vetoed. And it used to be that libertarians, before the Koch brothers really took over the Cato Institute, it used to be that libertarians were our shield against voter ID laws. There's still plenty of libertarians who aren't bought and sold subsidiaries of Koch Industries, who understand their principled and still hold their principled objections to voter ID laws. And that's why when you look at HR 1, it's close to 70% of the American people support it. Support cuts deep into the Republican Party for S1. Now S1's been passed, HR 1 was passed, exactly because there is a place where libertarians and liberals meet.
Cindy Grossman wonders, what can we realistically do to make the US Senate a more democratic institution that truly represents the populace?
Passing H.R. 1, overturning Citizens United, restoring the Voting Rights Act, and probably appropriately making pre-clearance a requirement for every state, because discrimination does flourish in corners of every state. Finally, recognizing Washington, D.C. We're the world's oldest democracy, and yet we've never allowed that democracy to extend to the citizens of our capital, who are bigger in number than some states. It's completely outrageous. So those would be top of my list.
Thank you. A question from Adrian D. Corporatization drives gentrification, which destroys Black and brown communities. How can we focus efforts to protect our homes from corporate dispossession due to the urban government's policies? And then in paren, usually in so-called liberal cities like San Francisco, Seattle, Oakland, and Portland.
Well, look, Bernie Sanders created the first community land trust in the country when he was mayor of Burlington. And we've begun to, replicate that in places like Baltimore County, Maryland. Detaching, if you will, ownership of the land and ownership of your home, because it's the land that's usually speculated with. It's your home that really is precious to you, is one of the smartest things I think that has been done on a micro or a community level. On the macro level, we've really got to make work pay again. I mean, we've got to be serious about passing the ERA. We got to be serious about raising the minimum wage, and then we can't stop there. Like it's got to keep up with inflation. If it had kept up with inflation, it'd be $23 right now. It's $7.25. We'd literally continue to allow the most vulnerable families in our society to be forced to subsidize the rest of us. It's outrageous. And so I think those basic issues of economic fairness really have to be, first and foremost. But if you're living in a community, I think the smartest things you can do is to build a community land trust.
How do you think President Biden's doing, especially on the issues you've been talking about? And do you think that he and his close advisors understand the urgent need to democratize our electoral apparatus?
And could I jump in for a minute just to ask, because Ben has known Kamala Harris for many, many years, known her sister. Kamala, I believe, endorsed you, Ben.
She did.
I'm just curious, building on that question, the role of vice president is one that can be defined and redefined depending on the time and the administration and the president. What would you hope to see? What portfolios, what role might she play that would be important in this next period and heading into 2024?
I'm waiting for the moment when the country really is able to see Kamala as the hero. Those of us who were watching her early career know her to be. Kamala ran for district attorney in San Francisco. She was very outspoken about her opposition to the death penalty in a state where there's one, California's one of the largest death rows in the country, and in a jurisdiction really ruled by Dianne Feinstein, who's defined a type of liberalism that's often right of Attila the Hun when it comes to criminal justice policy. And
you said it, I didn't.
All I know how to do is speak the truth. And it went back. I mean, in 76, a lot of women were running for office for the first time, and they were trained that you can be as liberal as you want, everything except for criminal justice.
It's true.
And Dianne Feinstein's maintained that discipline, and to great harm to Black and brown people in California. My childhood was split between West Baltimore in the summers with my grandparents and my school years in Northern California. So I grew up in that regime, and I speak frankly from a place of knowing the harm that it's done. And early in Kamala Harris's tenure, a young Black man, I think he was 19 years old, was accused of killing a police officer. And when I say the entire liberal establishment, I mean every player that was in the elected office or that put people in the elected office called her to explain to her that she had to make an exception for the killings of police officers. And she said, there's no exception. The death penalty makes no exceptions, and it's tendency to be racist or biased against the poor. Like, why would I make an exception? It's a horrible punishment, has no place in a civilized society. Dianne Feinstein read Kamala the Riot Act from the pulpit of the officer's funeral.
Wow.
And Kamala kept her backbone. Similarly, she had run for office saying that we needed to stop really going after sex workers and really focus on the Johns and the pimps. The police officers tested her early in her tenure. They arrested a bunch of women who worked in massage parlors, massage parlors and in strip clubs, and brought them in as accused prostitutes. And Kamala said, so what you're saying is that the club owners and the massage parlor owners are the pimps. Well, bring me the pimps, and then we can talk about these other lesser charges. Of course, the officers didn't want to be persona non grata at every strip club in town, so they never brought her the club owners, and she never brought the charges. And that's the Kamala that I know. I've known her for more than 15 years. And I believe that before this administration is over, the country will understand what a hero she can be. In the meantime, what I'd say is this: we've got friends in the White House and the vice presidency, and their president and their vice president. And all that means really at the end of the day is that they're a doorway that we can push open. Right. But you have to push, because the other side is pushing hard from the other direction. I think what we learned from the early years of Obama was that many of us just assumed he would do the right thing because he was a good person. When somebody's president, you've really got to respect the fact that they're under tremendous pressure from the other side, and you just got to have the courage to push hard. And so that's what we're doing. We, for example, recently really called on Kamala to overrule the parliamentarian in the Senate, and go ahead and pass the $15 minimum wage. We knew that meant speaking up to Joe Biden, but quite frankly, Joe Biden, had spoke up to Barack Obama in his own way on marriage equality to great effect when he got out ahead of Obama on marriage equality. So, turnabout's fair play, especially when each time it was in the interest of the people.
Yeah. Thank you. Erin, back to you.
Thanks. I have a question from Ann Martin, who's wondering specifically about the loss of franchise for people convicted of felonies, and if you see any path toward giving these people back their rights.
Absolutely. It means that we have to keep fighting hard in every state where it's still an issue. It's one of the things in HR 1 and S1. It would restore ex-felon voting rights, certainly at the federal level. At the state level, it really requires us being courageous in figuring out who agrees with us. I'll give you an example of what that can look like. In 2008, I had just become president of the NAACP, and a couple months later, Barack Obama won, and Tim Kaine, who was governor of Virginia, was on his way to become chairman of the DNC. Still had about a month left. And I called Tim and I said, Tim, you're a civil rights lawyer. You've built your career in politics in your days as a civil rights lawyer. Our families are from the same part of the state. My family's in the Richmond, Petersburg area. His is more from Richmond. And I said, you and I both know that in 1902, our state passed laws to make sure that people like my ancestors would no longer be able to hold office in Virginia. I descend from 2 Black Reconstruction statesmen in that state. And there were 5 pillars of that bill. And the only one that's left standing is the lifetime ban on formerly incarcerated people voting. Senator Glass at that Constitutional Convention, the same Glass, the Glass-Steagall Act, who was the treasurer under Woodrow Wilson and just as racist as Woodrow Wilson, said at the 1902 convention, because of these reforms, which included a lifetime ban on formerly incarcerated people voting, white supremacy will be reestablished as the rule of the land in every county in Virginia. Very plain. And so you figure you call a civil rights lawyer who's governor and you ask him to help overturn that in any way, and they're going to say, hell yeah. But Tim Kaine said no. He said, I promised the people of Virginia I would not use my constitutional powers in that way. All I was asking him to do was to basically offer blanket clemency to any person who had been incarcerated, allowing them to restore their voting rights. No other aspect of their sentence will be impacted. Just simply allow them to vote. They serve their time, allow them to vote when they're in the community. And he said no. Well, the next governor that came in was Bob McDonnell. He was a Republican. He had been the attorney general. He was right wing. He also came from a very working class Irish family, lower middle class Irish American family. And in Virginia, Irish Americans have been kind of just above Black folks going way back. You read your Howard Zinn's People's History, look at the rebellion in 1663 in Gloucester, Virginia. It'll tell you everything that you need to know about that reality. And so, and he also was very religious. And so I sat with McDonnell and he said, sure, I'll do anything. I'll do everything I can do. It's just the right thing, Ben. It's just the right, people paid their time, they should be able to vote. And Bob McDonnell then went about, we spent 2-3 years trying to get his party to actually pass it legislatively. And when they ultimately refused, at the end, because in Virginia, you only get one term, we set up a process that made it one page, to just fill out one page form to get your voting rights restored. And almost automatically they would be restored. And rather than the several hundred that Kaine had re-enfranchised, McDonnell enfranchised thousands.
Wow.
And now the Democrats keep it going. Terry McAuliffe took it to an even higher level, for example. But without a Republican showing courage, I'm not sure that they ever would have, because they were so afraid of having their, Kaine intended to run for Senate and so forth, having their careers impacted by, doing the right thing, that we had to first find a Republican who would do it before they would have courage on the issue. And it's one of the many ways that mainstream Democrats continue to betray Black people and continue to betray poor white people. We, at the end of the day, yeah, Blacks were hugely disproportionately represented in America's prisons. And yet, America doesn't just have the most incarcerated Black people on the planet. We also have the most incarcerated white people on the planet. And there's about 1 million or so at any point of each behind bars. And so it really is something where, quite frankly, when you sit with a Republican who represents a state like Virginia, they've got a lot of constituents that they see all the time, at their right-wing rallies, who are impacted by this too. And that's been one of the sort of ways that we've been able to build bipartisan coalitions on these issues, but it starts with having the courage to actually ask them and give them the opportunity to join us on the matter.
With best light turn here, we have a question from Jordan Weltman. Is there anything we can do to fight the big lie, or are we destined to live with it going forward? And are you concerned about where it might lead?
There's so many big lies. Which
I
one
know.
are we talking about?
The big.
So I believe the big lie about the election being stolen.
Oh, God, that one.
Yeah.
30% of America believes that the election was stolen. It is the impact of, frankly, several things layered on top of each other. I believe it really starts with media deregulation. And I don't know that we ever get that genie back in the bottle. The fact that we can have entirely hate networks where people have just their own alternative reality, and their idea of cross-referencing is like, did Rush Limbaugh say it? Okay, Alex Jones says it's true too, and so does Glenn Beck, and rest his soul, Rush Limbaugh. I don't wish death on anybody, but it's nice not to hear him on the airwaves. But they're cross-referencing three extremists. That's a problem. It's a bit orthogonal, but I believe that when you look at that, when you look at the impact of conspiracy theories online, when you look at the way in which Facebook recruits people into the most extremist groups, whether it's ISIS or whether it's QAnon, what can we really do to make this nation one nation and pull people together? I think the best thing that we could do actually is nationalize public service, to actually have a 2-year requirement that every young person, spend 2 years of their life serving this country, whether it's teaching it, or it's helping with healthcare, or it's some sort of works progress administration effort, or, it's joining the military, whatever they want to do, because we got to get young people to know each other across lines of geography, of faith, of race, of class, and develop kind of other ways to cross-reference what the truth is. These things really only hold up. These lies are insulated by people's isolation from each other. And ultimately, it's in the best interest of our country to figure out how we break down the walls of isolation.
Thank you. If I know that my colleague Alana has put the link to Ben's recent editorial on thenation.com in the chat, and maybe she can drop it in one more time. It's very thoughtful. I suggest everybody read it. And Ben, you know what you wrote, but I'm just going to say that in your editorial, you wrote that getting the Constitution's "we the people" to mean all the people has been brutal. And you've been talking a bit about that. And I wonder, really, what's it going to take? You've talked about courage, you've talked about big programs like national service. What's it going to take to get us there?
Simply, it's just going to take a movement of people in this country who really understand in their bones that we have been moving in the right direction for a long time, that the arc of the moral universe is long, and ultimately bends towards justice, and that we're the ones who have to bend it. And that's why people being part of this community of The Nation magazine is so important. It's why I'm so proud of it, because it goes back so long. And The Nation wasn't always perfect in its editorial positions, but it ultimately got to the right place, and usually faster than the country did. And that's why I think the value of being part of this community. It also, I think, takes the humility of memory, of all of us remembering. What I often remind groups, you'll go to talk to a group, young people, diverse, and maybe some of them are there because the professor required them to be there. And you'll say, okay, everyone, why don't you raise your hands? Raise your hand if you descend from somebody who was held in slavery. Okay, keep your hands up. Raise your hand if you're a member of a group of color, any other color, Black, brown, Asian American, Native American, but your people weren't held in slavery. Keep your hand up. Raise your hand if you descend from a white man who was too poor to own land. Keep your hand up. Raise your hand if you descend from a woman. And of course, people pause on that last one. That occurs to me, everybody descends from a woman. That's mom. And they all raise their hand. I said, well, what that means is that everybody in this room descends from at least one group, often two, sometimes three, that had their right to vote stripped from them at the very beginning of this country.
Yeah.
And then had to have it restored to them at some point in American history. And the one that may have surprised you was white men who were too poor to own any land. We also call them the Revolutionary War privates. They were the people most likely to be killed. They were the very front lines of the Revolutionary War. And here's the thing, they didn't really get their right to vote restored until around the 1850s. So we went almost 100 years denying them the right to vote. And the argument for doing so was one of vote security. And we really have to understand that the tell when somebody's trying to suppress the vote is they argue vote security. And what did they say then? I mean, they said, it was vote security because, Black folks didn't have the mental capacity to vote. It was vote security because if you allowed women to vote, then a man with a wife would have two votes. I tried that experiment at home, y'all. It doesn't work so well. And then and they would also say that we couldn't let a man who didn't own property vote because he was not tethered to a place. And that mobs could go, never happened, but it's theoretically possible. Mobs could go from town to town, stealing elections wherever they went. And of course that never happened. But that was the argument that kept white men who were too poor to own property from voting for about 75 years at the beginning of our country, maybe even 80. And so the humility that's memory compels us to make sure that what was done to our ancestors is not done to anybody else. And I think ultimately is the stuff that really strengthens the type of movement that the nation maintains. It helps to maintain the type of movement that we build up people for the American way.
Thank you so much for joining us, if I might. For your truly thoughtful, inspiring, hopeful, courageous, and at the same time pragmatic and very personal remarks. I hope everyone on this call will find your book. You described it earlier, sort of your Zen's, but very much yours. And I think what you're saying about memory is so true. Someone once said it's the United States of amnesia, and that memory is a radical act. And I'm struck by that because Think of the attacks on the 1619 Project. Think of the Biden administration now suggesting more money for history and civics classes. Think of the possibilities of multi-generational conversations that could happen if there was a real arena on the internet or in finding ways to come together. And I think your idea is very powerful about national service. It's been tried, brought up, but it's kind of radically offline in a wonderful way because online has its issues. I wanted to just suggest to everyone on the call to find out more about the Young Electeds Project, People For. We had 4 women at the Nation, Erin will remember this, about 2 years ago, one from Orlando, Florida, someone from San Francisco, and they were all young electeds and doing great things. And the mayor of Ithaca, as Ben says, is someone to watch. And I think that's the power moving forward. Also, people in the pipeline. I don't know about you or Ben, but I take solace. I love that years ago there was kind of an animus toward electoral politics, but we're seeing movement people go into electoral politics like Stacey Abrams or Pramila Jayapal. And I find that very powerful and hopeful. And we are seeking hope. I wanted to tell people on the call, we have someone who's run for office and won in the most rural part of Maine, Chloe Maxman, a former Nation Student Fellow, is going to be on in about 2 weeks. We have the Pulitzer Prize winning Vietnamese writer, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who has a new book out called The Sympathizer. And from our radical parenting issue, we have Chesa Boudin, who Ben probably knows. He's coming on to talk about the issue he wrote about how he was raised. And he is now, as you know, this DA in San Francisco. And I suggested to my colleagues at the Nation, we make him a cover, but no one believed he would be elected. There you see the limits of vision. But in any case, Ben, I thank you again for joining. And what do you talked about so many issues. Is DC statehood something that People For has taken up, will take up? It's rising. And it's,
yeah, absolutely. I think its time is coming. The Jesse Jackson, Julian Bond,
good. Yeah.
All made it kind of a decades-long focus of their work. There's a rising group of leaders in Washington, D.C. And what makes me excited is that movements like the movement that Bernie Sanders built across this country have just taken a moment to think about our democracy. And in other parts of the country, you're seeing people ask the question, like, why doesn't D.C. have statehood? Yeah. And so, yes, we're impassioned supporters of it. If folks are looking for one thing to do, please call your senator and tell them to have courage on S1 and the For the People Act. Just really want to think. Now my book won't be out until 2022, so don't look for it now.
All right.
There is a book out called Reach: 40 Black Men Speak on Living, Leading, and Succeeding. I published a decade ago, and it's a great gift for a young person. And we call the autobiography of Malcolm X for the ADHD generation, because all the biography is like 6 pages. And I just, thank you for having me. I really love the Nation. I love the community of folks who support it, and I hope to be back, and hopefully when that book is ready.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank all of you for coming from different points across the country. And may we continue having great conversations like the one we've had with Ben. And we need your work, Ben.